Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to Thinking Out Loud at HOK. It's great to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming along on what will be quite a momentous occasion for our country, given that the general election was announced to coincide with our talk. I scheduled first, just so that everybody knows. My name is Farah, and I'm the marketing principal for HOK's London studio. And so to our speaker this morning, Emma's passion for our industry started back when she studied town planning at UCL. This opened her eyes to the impact that bricks and mortar can have on how we live our lives. Field trips at university range from attempting to sketch classical buildings in Venice through to visits to rundown estates in Newcastle. Emma became fascinated with regeneration and what can change do for people. She believes successful communities go hand in hand with developing employment opportunities, safe, warm homes, and support. Emma joined British Land after 7 years at Landsec, where she delivered a number of central London mixed-use developments, as well as overseeing the company's strategic land portfolio. Prior to this, Emma held development and land management roles at house builders Barratt and Crest Nicholson. Emma is joint head of Canada Water, British Land, and a member of the executive committee. She joined British Land in 2014 and has joint responsibility for the development of the group's assets at Canada Water. She also founded British Land's Women's Network. The group was established to help women connect, contribute, and grow. Outside of work, Emma is a board member of the Pathways to Property Reading Real Estate Foundation and a development committee member for the BPF. More recently, Emma was selected amongst the top 46 most influential women in the real estate industry. And so, without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce the exceptional Emma Cariaga. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everybody. This is very early, I think, for a talk like this, but well done for all getting here. And I hope nobody has been stopped from voting this morning. I'm going to talk about social parity and spend the next 20 minutes or so sort of sharing some thoughts on how I think about social parity and how it applies in context to a place called Canada Water, where I've got the amazing responsibility to try and deliver a new town centre for London. Social parity is my definition for fairness in society. It's not a new phenomena, but I think increasingly we would all agree that it seems to be the new buzzword, hopefully not running the risk of being the same buzzword of placemaking or sustainability, but I think we all know what we mean when we see it done well. It's certainly affecting our industry, my industry being real estate, but I think it's deeper than that. And perhaps, as Farah's intimated, on this day, quite a symbolic day for Great Britain, the general election, and there's some big choices ahead for this country. And I've certainly seen how this campaign has exposed quite how divided we all are, and importantly, kind of shine a light on some of the kind of damning inequalities that we see in this country. And I know, and I'm not naive enough to expect that me or anybody in this room can necessarily kind of solve the NHS crisis. I think we can and should do our part and play our part in investing with a social conscience and striving for better. And in terms of striving for better, I'm going to talk to you about Canada Water. But I need to start with this slide and with this woman, Ada. Ada Salter is possibly London's, certainly Southwark's, first ethical socialist. Born in 1866, she was London's first woman councillor and mayor, and she fought her way in the world, well ahead of her time, striving for social parity in her part of London. I think she's probably the well-being vanguard. And how she went about doing that was helping the poor, investing in Bermondsey, in amongst some of the poorest parts of southeast London, doing her bit to improve their lot. She took a slightly different view on what was, the answer to some of those challenges, and for her it was about well-being, as we call it now. She greened the streets of Bermondsey and was responsible in her lifetime for planting over 7,000 trees. But it was perhaps her vision for community building that's the most relevant for me, and she was instrumental there in organising activities for that community, reasons for those people, poor as they were, to come together, make social connections. She created concerts, organised games, created community facilities, and her drive for bringing people together is perhaps very relevant for some of today's modern issues of loneliness, isolation, poor mental health that we still are grappling with as we bring forward bits of real estate. Before I get on to talk about the master plan that we're bringing forward, the other part that I wanted to touch on was more recent history, and that's the history of Canada Water as a dockland. Up until the late 60s, about 70% of the area now known as Canada Water was covered in docks. It was active, it was where ships from North America and Scandinavia arrived, normally with timber for feeding London's construction industry. And in the late 60s, that all stopped. The London Docklands Development Corporation arrived, and them, together with Southwark Council, set about filling everything in and turning it into something like this. But the pattern and some of the memories still survive, and so what you can see is a post-industrial landscape, but certainly some of the remnants of the docks were still there, were still evident, and what was once docks was certainly in many cases turned into parkland. And so that brings me to today and to our investment in Canada Water, which is in front of you in the slide, edge green, and that represents 53 acres, which is a collective effort between British Land and Southwark Council. It's a partnership where we both own vested interests. We have some leasehold interests, they have freeholds, and we've come together to create a new town centre for London in the area that was once an active dock. And before I come on to talk to you about our master plan and what we want to bring forward, I thought I'd just play for you a video which is a collection of voices from that local community talking about what their hopes and dreams are for the place that they call home.
What's unique about this area?
The water, the people, and some of the lovely old buildings that we've got. It's a place with a lot of green space. It's a sort of quiet, calm oasis, and a lot of people come to this area because of the fact that it's a peninsula.
I think the history of what is known as Rotherhithe Village is fascinating.
The print works, I think the word has to be exciting. I mean, it's just such a great place to come now.
It takes its character from the former docks that used to be here. Still have the Canada Basin, the Russia Dock woodland.
It has a great contrast between the old and the new.
This area means everything to me, it's the old docks. The place has changed because in them days there was a good few thousand people worked in here, It's just a hive of activity.
There's a real sense of community here, and there's loads of people that are really up for getting involved in things, which is really exciting.
So Surrey Docks Farm is a small community farm in Rotherhithe. We've been running for 41 years now and are very much part of the community. So we're free to visit 7 days a week. Local people can come and enjoy the venue, and we have lots of volunteers and participants from the area as well.
We're here in Canada Water to see how we can build something with the people that are here. We've been working in schools, Bead House. We've also worked with Time and Talents.
Time and Talents has been around for many, many years. We want to create a community that is open to everyone and a place where everyone feels part of a community.
The potential here with the biggest development in central London going on is totally unique, and retail is in good demand in the location.
The location is changed for the better. It started good, and we had the recession. Everything went completely down, and now it's coming up for the better and better and better.
And the print works was going to move to Thurrock. It took a year to take the presses out. The company that are in now have absolutely regenerated this whole building.
The centre offers a good local and convenient facility. I think the opportunities are to provide something a lot greater, more of a town centre that will create and bind the community together, really.
We do need a new town centre, we've always said that, because this place lay derelict for years. From the tower blocks where I live, you could see right the way down to the river. So something had to be done, there had to be a plan put together.
I think with new buildings, a sense of scale, buildings that actually serve people, I hope we do have a good town centre. That's one thing we do lack.
What you want is something that brings everybody together, and I mean everybody, from kids to old people to young people.
I think the most important thing is that it becomes a place that's even more inclusive and where everybody has an opportunity to relate to each other, to be mutually supportive and to feel like they're all part of the same community in a sense. Obviously there'll always be people with different backgrounds and different interests, but they can still have a sense of place and somewhere they really belong.
I show that video because I think, given the theme of this talk and given the industry that we all work in, I think we all know the benefit of engagement, we all know the value that it brings, but I think very often we just don't have the luxury of time to be able to properly listen and properly take any notice. And so we've been fortunate, possibly at Canada Water, of being able to have both the luxury of time and the luxury of being able to respond and adapt. And so for the last 5 years, we've been having a very deep conversation with many of the people on the video, but also hundreds and thousands of the 30,000 people who live in the local area and for whom this is their town centre already. We've been listening to what they love, we've been listening to what they want for the better, and actually over that time have had many iterations of the master plan that's been able to reflect and respond, not always agree, but where we can adapt our plans. And so I think by the time we submitted our planning application, we were at version 25. There were numerous attempts to respond, and as a result, we submitted a planning application with many of the support from the local community, which I think reflects the investment and the time we took to engage. I think the other thing to say about this issue is that it's not ours alone, British Lands. We have a partner in Canada Water, which is Southwark Council. And for them, it was really important that Canada Water was, from the start, setting its stall out as to what it can do for social regeneration. It's a borough which has seen a number of regeneration schemes and has felt the scars of some of those long, protracted negotiations over decades in many cases. And could Canada Water be a chance where we could take a different approach and have a different conversation? And for us, we as a business, and I think as an investor in the local area, want to be able to look back on our development and our investment in 10 to 15 years' time and ask ourselves whether or not we've done our very best to show how our investment can properly touch and change the lives of people who live there. And so to do that and to put a bit of rigour around what we mean by that, we've created a social regeneration charter, which is holding our and Southwark Council's collective feet to the fire to say, in 10 years' time or in 2 years' time or next year, show us what meaningful change you have created. Show us how local people have really benefited from those employment opportunities, or has anybody locally been able to afford any of those homes that you are building? So really meaningful indications that can tangibly track the outcome and the benefit and the impact of an investment of this scale, which I think goes some way, to showing a sense of responsibility and a sense of social conscience. And on the theme of parity, I think everybody's very well versed in affordable housing. I think we've probably all got slightly different definitions. We all think it's probably for slightly different sectors of the community. And that debate will ensue. We will deliver 35% affordable housing at Canada Water. The majority of that is what I think we all call council housing, so truly affordable housing. But beyond homes, the other aspect for us at Canada Water that's been important has to look at affordability across other sectors. And what I mean by that is affordable workspace, affordable retail, genuinely discounted spaces that are sub-market in terms of their pricing, with allocations and nominations that try to ensure that local businesses and local entrepreneurs can too start a business or grow a business at Canada Water. So parity for us is across both, as I say, residential accommodation, but increasingly moving into what is perhaps a more traditional commercial world. And on the theme of parity, I mentioned Ada Salter at the start and the work that she did to try and create social connections. And that's given us a lot to think about in terms of how we're going to bring forward this development, both how we're going to build it, but importantly, as a long-term investor and holder of space, how we're going to manage that space over the medium and long term. And I can best encapsulate it by talking about the Wednesday afternoon bell. And for any of you in the audience who were educated in the UK, typically, and certainly in the case of my children, Wednesday afternoon is still sports afternoon, where people put their pens down and go out to play sport. I think for anybody educated in a UK university, still on Wednesday afternoons, it's club afternoons where people don't study. And so we're going to bring the notion of a day, doesn't have to be Wednesday, to Canada Water, where we will encourage people to do things together, whether it's sport or whether or not it's volunteering, doesn't really matter, but we will at scale help facilitate a programme of activities to try and create those social connections, some of those relationships that Ada and her colleagues started all those years ago. So now for the master plan. I'm conscious I'm speaking to a number of architects and I haven't shown you any buildings yet. So there's a few to come, not many, but I will talk about the master plan. And I suppose what I would say is a couple of things. Firstly, I think what's different about this master plan is the mix of uses. It's almost 50-50 between residential space and commercial space. And I think that's unusual for large-scale master plans that tend to be more biased to a single use with supporting uses, either a residential-led master plan or an office-led one. And I think this is perhaps a bit different, being split almost between both those uses in equal measures. And why I think that's important is because for a town centre to be successful with the strife that we know is in our retail sector, you need footfall. You need people around at different times of the day, all the way through the week. And so having employees there as well as people living there is a better indicator of being able to drive footfall at different times of the day. We are creating London's first new high street for over 100 years at Canada Water. Why is she doing that, you might say, when retail's under some stress? Why would you bring forward 1 million square feet of retail and leisure? Retail is changing, but in our experience, it's still very sound in areas around transport connectivity, in areas around high footfall. But those spaces, those retail spaces, need to be ones that can adapt to a changing city. And so we'll be creating a new high street, but probably not one as we know it. This is going to be a 24-hour high street, spaces that will be different things at different times of the day to allow for a town centre that functions much more intensively than many that we will know. And then I did promise you I'd just touch on a couple of buildings. And so I just wanted to walk you through some of the public spaces that I suppose are where we're spending most of our time investing. We have got probably 45 buildings on that master plan. I haven't designed all of them, but what we have spent time thinking about very hard is the public spaces. How will people move across this master plan? How will they want to come together for that Wednesday afternoon session? And so this is the park, the new Printworks park that is on the eastern side of the master plan, which will be that flexible space where people can come together and create memories and relationships. This is our new town square. Proportion-wise, to give you a sense, it's about the same size as Leicester Square in terms of scale, so really generous spaces, flexible for public gatherings, for open concerts, a really wonderful place to just sit and be, and then quiet places of more contemplation. At a town centre kind of scale, you need, we think, spaces of all sides, and this is a courtyard framed by a couple of the buildings at the start of the high street, so you can be on the high street if you want to, but if you want a place for more contemplation, then this is one of them. And then just thinking about routes and people's journey home. You know, often developers really invest their time and invest their energy in the big set pieces, and we've got some of those, but really starting to think about how the sort of finer grain edges of our master plan work, again, not from an architectural point of view, but as a user and as a resident or employee coming to work or to live at Canada Water. What does your walk home feel like? How will you experience that? What will you see? And just encouraging those serendipitous connections and meetings to happen. So that's all I wanted to say about the master plan. You might ask why a developer is sort of here talking to you about social parity. Why am I not sort of showing you lots of buildings? You might think, you know, social parity is a developer's kind of latest ruse to secure planning permission, to kind of cement community relations ahead of a planning application. And I really would, you know, urge you to think about it more in terms of value. We at British Land have, I suppose, over the last 5 years been investing in our communities team, investing in the relationships that we build locally, not because that's going to necessarily make planning permissions any easier. I think we all know that you need to do much more than that. But we do it because we think it drives value. I'm a developer, my responsibility is to return value to our shareholders, and I make no apologies for that. And we think that by investing the time, taking the time to listen, to respond, to change your plans, and to do so with a social conscience is actually about creating value. Thank you. And I'm told by Farah we now have time for questions. So if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to attempt to answer them.
Shane Fay from Blue 3. I'm also a resident at Canada Water. So I must commend you the engagement I've seen to date with the local community, and the forums for us to be able to consult has been very well received. The one thing that I hear a lot about from the other concerns from other residents, and especially the people that have been through the LDDC, the London Docklands development, there's concerns about how that became a bit of a sort of abandoned white elephant in areas such as Wapping and Tobacco Dock. There was a lot of investment, built that sort of thing, and then become empty and not used. So what's the concerns there, and how are you going to address that as a potential, we build something great, but then it doesn't get the attention it needs?
And I think it's a fair point. I think there are a lot of parts of London where development has happened en masse, and then we look back and think we could have done better. My take on it, our approach is that areas that do better are ones that have a variety of different uses. And that's, I suppose, going back to the master plan, why I think the introduction of employment space to a place like Canada Water is so important. It's a suburban location today, defined by two-storey housing. If you haven't been, by the way, it's the most incredible part of London with almost every housing typology known to man. It was a mini experiment, actually, in many ways, of architecture over the last 40 or 50 years. And it's enchanting, but at various parts of the day, it's pretty empty, you know, as most areas which are defined by residential are. So we think bring employment, 2 million square feet of offices creates 20,000 people. That starts to give you the basis to create demand for retail, for restaurants, for cafes, for culture, education, employment. And that, we think, is the answer to a thriving town centre. I think the point you make about sort of the legacy, I suppose, my response would be that we, together with Southwark Council, are long-term landowners. We don't sell very much. We tend to hold on to it and manage it. So for us, driving a long-term income and driving, you know, increases in rents over time is our motivation, which means that we do invest in place. We want to manage and enhance that place over time. So I think mixture of uses and management is probably key.
Hello, morning. Gary Clark, HOK. Fantastic talk. As an ex-resident of Southwark many years ago, I do know what that area was like, and it's amazing to see the change there. In terms of the question I was going to ask really is about curation. You're creating fantastic spaces, 24-hour use, mixed use, so all the ingredients are there. But how do you really get that community spirit, working, and how do you create events? And what kind of plans have you got with Southwark on that, if you can share?
I think it's really tricky, actually, because there is some that say that over-curation is a bit toe-curlingly awful. You know, I don't necessarily like to be told very often that I'm going to do something at a certain time. We're all quite spontaneous. We want choice, and then we decide. So I think there's a balance we need to strike between creating a programme and not forcing people to engage. This isn't a Stepford town we're creating. But I suppose our starter for 10 is the Printworks, which as an ex-resident you may know was the Daily Mail printing press for decades, and in 2012 it stopped. The Mail moved to Thurrock, and they left us with this voluminous space which was costing us hundreds of thousands of pounds stuck empty. And whilst we were getting planning permission and developing our master plan, we turned it into a venue. So we now have music events, concerts. We've got the 9th best nightclub in the world at the Printworks. For those of you that haven't been, it's worth a go. And I suppose it's that sort of trial and error approach to Canada Water and events that I think will define what we will do there. I think I love spaces that are a bit scruffy, spaces that kind of, delight and enthuse you, and the South Bank and Covent Garden do that brilliantly. Every time you turn up, there's something different going on. You don't know quite what you're going to get, but you know it's going to be interesting. So the challenge for us is how we can, recreate some of that spontaneity in events and programme management, which I think you can do when you've got the scale that we have, and also with developers whose incentive is to grow income over time. I think it's really important that our objectives are aligned with a place, and driving rents over time, sounds like a rapacious developer, but actually I think that is quite important to our investment in that place, not just as we build it, but actually for decades to come. So give it another try. Come back to the Printworks and have a dance. Yeah. Saturday.
Shirley Waldron from Delver Patman Redler. earlier in the year, HOK's Thinking Out Loud series, there was a talk by Andrew Ibrahim from your Hong Kong office, and he was talking about designing for health. And it seems to me that architecture is as much about designing buildings as it is about designing places, and how we design places which now focus as much on well-being and health of the people that use the spaces and use the buildings. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on that.
We do. I mean, we're very fortunate in the part of London that we operate. It's sort of equidistant between King's College Hospital and Guy's and St Thomas's. We're sort of in the elbow, if you like, between both of those. And we've been chatting to them about how you use something like Canada Water as an opportunity for designing for health. I suppose there's the obvious architectural kind of response, and I'm a lowly planner, so I'll have a go. But you know, with 53 acres and with a town centre, we could control the microclimate around those buildings. You know, we have the opportunity to build buildings, build offices where you can open the window. And so designing buildings with health in mind, you know, could be quite exemplary almost at that sort of scale. But our focus at this stage has been much more around the public spaces and ensuring that our programme of the Wednesday afternoon bell creates opportunities for people to come and do sport together, to come and meet one another, and you know, tackle some of the chronic issues around social isolation and loneliness, which affects a lot of people who live in city centres and town centres. And I think we can play a role in that. So part architecture, but also it's partly about how you manage spaces and the sort of programme of events that I think can ensure that health plays a big part.
Benoît Dufour from Argent. So you talked about responsibility of developers, so social responsibilities. And to expand on health and well-being and public spaces, I assume also you probably have a big push on sustainability and making sure this project is doing its bit to deal with climate change and climate emergency or things like that. So if you could expand on that.
Yeah. The advantage of working on something like Canada Water is there's almost no topic that doesn't affect us or that we're not thinking about. And, you know, of course, we are very alive to the climate emergency, and I suppose my response would be quite simple actually. When you are designing a new bit of city at this stage and at this level of master planning, you have got to just allow flexibility. You know, if we knew now what we should have known 5 years ago, we wouldn't be designing the buildings we're all designing, right? So my job is to ensure that we have got nothing here that precludes new technologies, new ideas, new ways of heating and cooling buildings over time. And I suppose similar to the previous question, at this scale, you can do that. I mean, you'll know from your experience at King's Cross, scale gives you the luxury of being able to respond and adapt to technologies rather than being too prescriptive in 2019 for buildings that are not going to be built for 15 years.
Group. Just taking that theme a little bit further and talking about master planning, and appreciate you are at a relatively early stage of development. One of the challenges with that part of London is connectivity, transportation. So on the one hand, there will be a continuing need for people to need access to cars and private transport, which is going to be detrimental to air quality, carbon usage. Appreciate perhaps you have certain limitations as a developer and a master planner in how you can dictate transport policy, but have you been able to actually push that agenda at all to encourage some form of low carbon transport, active travel, or indeed discourage the use of the car, but in a way that encourages people still to be mobile and have access to other facilities?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And transport is probably the topic that we've talked about the most at Canada Water. It's fortunate in that we've got the Jubilee line and the London Overground line interchanging at Canada Water, but there is some stress on that junction and often some levels of overcrowding. Ironically, actually, building offices at Canada Water and creating reasons to get off the Jubilee line and off the London Overground to come out and to come and work at Canada Water creates some capacity for people who want to get on. But we're not building any new Jubilee lines or London Overground lines, and so our transport strategy has been trying to encourage behavioural change in how people move across the city. There's no residential car parking as part of this master plan. There's something like 10,000 cycling spaces. But actually behind that, a whole series of measures as to what we're going to do to encourage people to make different decisions and to get to where they need to. Canada Water is incredibly well connected. It's just that nobody knows it's there. Unless you live there, many people think it's north of the river. The sense of awareness about how close this is. It's a 9-minute cycle ride to the Bank of England from Canada Water. So encouraging people to get on their bike, encouraging people to walk. We'll be making some improvements at the 2 stations. There's a new station entrance at Surrey Quays. So there's no kind of big silver bullet, but a whole series of measures which over the lifetime of this project we think will encourage people to make more sustainable choices about how they move across the city. And hopefully, I think for the residents who spoke earlier, just encouraging people in the wider area to start to make different choices. Canada Water, bless them, the LLDC, created some phenomenal cul-de-sac type developments in Canada Water, and there is an over-reliance on the car, largely through lack of choice with poor bus services. And making this sort of investment, we think, and the transport improvements that come about off the back of it, you might see some ripple effect of people making different choices within our red line, but also hopefully on the wider community.
Hi, Lee Mallett. You mentioned your community engagement. Could you tell us, were there any specific examples of how the community influenced your master plan? And then secondly, were you able, or have you thought about ways of expressing social value in the same way that you use economic value to measure the worth of the buildings? Can you tell us a bit about how you represented social value?
Sure. So taking the first question about the impact of engagement on our plans, I think I mentioned we think we got to Master Plan 25 by the time we submitted our outline planning application. And that was as a result of that 5 years of engagement with, I think we spoke to just over 5,000 people at a whole range of events. And we worked really hard actually at trying to find different ways of engaging so as to kind of avoid talking to the same people over the same 5 years. So we had mobile exhibitions that did the rounds at the TRA halls. We did one-to-ones, we did formal exhibitions. We worked quite hard at a range of different ways of engaging. And we changed things. So a good example would be there is a new leisure centre that gets built in the first phase of this master plan. And our original location for that went down really badly. People didn't like it there. The residents who it backed up against didn't like it. The design of the leisure centre wasn't what people wanted. And there's a big kind of civic piece in the first phase. That's important. That's got to be a service that's wanted, that's used, and so we moved it to a different location. Other things we've been able to do, again, possibly with the luxury of scale, is reduce the heights of buildings. Always, a sensitive topic, and there were quite a few tall buildings that people felt, near them or near residential areas were too high, and so we've been able to reduce those. On the question of social value, I think almost not a week goes past without somebody else trying to define what mean by social value. I think the RIBA have had a go or are having a go. Arup, I think, have done some work on it. And we are having our own go through the Social Regeneration Charter. And that has got some very specific themes that we're trying to tackle. Themes around access to employment, themes around health, and themes around sort of sense of inclusion. And Southwark has some pretty scary stats actually on a range of those indices. And so how we're going to measure our impact is how people in those core groups lot has improved over the time. And so just being very targeted, I suppose, in a number of areas and actively demonstrating how we are improving things. And if we're not, changing to find another way of tackling those issues and making some change. Because I think we know that we won't get it right first time. We know that places evolve over quite a long period of time, and this will be certainly 10 years, if not a bit more. And so it'd be mad to try and sort of set out anything too prescriptive without moments of reflection and recalibration along that journey if our original intentions, for whatever reason, are not making the impact we felt we would.
Katerina from Mace. So I discovered Canada Water through Printworks. So it's really cool.
Congratulations.
So I just want to, you've done amazing work about consulting the local community in the stage of master planning. But from my work, I realized that to create a sense of community, people need to feel that they have a say, they belong, and the sense of ownership. So when everything will be built, how you will ensure that the people who live there will feel that they still have a say and they can actually change or shape the space as they think that to be a little bit more spontaneous, as you said earlier.
Sure. I suppose the way I would respond to that is in the many exhibitions that we did and the conversations we had, engaging with professionals, as you all are. You understand scale, you understand master plan, and you understand the process. When you're not a professional, when you're a local resident, there was a perception that they were turning up to look at a master plan and that was what they were going to get. And so this sort of need to fix everything at the master plan stage was a fear, actually, locally. But it's actually the reverse. This is a master plan with probably 40 buildings on it, and only 3 of those have been designed in detail, which means that there's 42 at least still to be designed. And as we bring forward each of those buildings, there will be an engagement on the design, on the form, on the function, on the materiality. And so I think that reassured a lot of people, actually, that there's going to be an ongoing dialogue, not just at the master plan stage, but as buildings come forward, as part of the master plan that perhaps best relates to where they live or where their interests lie. And again, through the luxury of scale, you're able to chart that engagement for them, and they will have an ongoing engagement and participation in this process for decades if they want it. And that's certainly, once you got that message across, and once people got a sense that this wasn't it, ticked, signed off, and that was what they were going to get, but it was a much more of a dialogue they could engage with for a long time. I think people relaxed a bit. I think Farah's given me the. I think that's it. Thank you.
What I was really pleased to see is the social engagement aspect. I mean, having been there over the last few years and been invited to many of these forums, it's great that they've listened and actually some of the changes, and like she said, there's been 25 versions. So it is good to see that the aspects are adapting. It's not fixed in stone and there's still some flexibility around it. Coming from the construction sector, for myself, it's quite interesting to see how that's going to translate into the real world. But they've really given it a lot of thought and a lot of effort up front in this early initial stages of the design, which is not always the case. So it's quite nice to see. It's a very inclusive sort of environment around there. I've got a dog that walks through the park, so the open spaces, the social aspect and interaction there's like dog walking groups that, you hear all the gossip that's going on, all about the developments, what's going to be changing, all the planning applications that people are contesting. So there is a real community spirit there that, goes back decades. People are there before the recent developments, people from the days of working in the docks. And then, they've been through these changes, they've seen the changes in these developments. Some for the better, some not so good, but it's good to see them challenge as well, because they're not afraid to speak up, which is always nice to see.